Hello, welcome to KBC's Bible study. And today we are looking at the phrase, the blind leading the blind. Our text is Matthew 23, 13 to 26. The blind leading the blind. That's a very familiar term, isn't it? One that's been adopted into our language. And many familiar expressions have their origins in the Bible. For instance, there's a time and a place for everything. A drop in the bucket, going the extra mile. The writing is on the wall, out of the mouths of babes, and today's reading, the blind leading the blind. So they found their way into our common usage. We usually use it, that phrase, the blind leading the blind, to describe leaders who don't know what they're doing. But that implies some ignorance on their part. And its original context, it meant a little bit more than that. And Jesus uses the phrase 3 times in the Gospels, once in Luke, twice in Matthew. And this is to describe the Pharisees. Yes, they were leaders, but they seemed, rather than being ignorant and don't know what they're doing, they seemed to know exactly what they were doing. So what made them blind? Well, their problem wasn't ignorance, it was hypocrisy. And hypocrisy of the worst kind. They didn't practice what they preached. It made them spiritually unfit to lead those who needed teaching. And in this passage, Jesus is searing in his criticism of the Pharisees. Read it. He does not hold back. He gives them both barrels. Now, that phrase, a guide for the blind, was a common title, I think, and according to some commentaries, for Jewish leaders or teachers of the day. In Romans 2, verse 19, Paul uses the phrase when he addresses people who want to be teachers. He challenges them and says, you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, i.e. a teacher, a light for those who are in the dark. That's the text. So when you think of it, it's quite a good phrase, isn't it? For a teacher, a guide for the blind, those whose job it is to bring to light those who don't know, who are in the dark. So a teacher should be equipped to do that important job. So when Jesus uses the phrase, the blind leading the blind, he is adapting a current phrase to describe the Pharisees. And what he's really saying is, don't follow them. Don't listen to them. They'll only lead you into trouble, just as a blind person leading another blind person is likely to do. They'll both fall into the same pit. The reference to that, Matthew 15:14. So leading up to his damning description of the religious leaders, the Pharisees, Jesus explains in a little bit more detail, with example after example, of how the Pharisees regularly broke the laws of God while demanding that others follow their human-made rules. They sort of displayed this outward show of holiness, but being pretty corrupt on the inside, in their hearts. An example of what we mean by this can be seen in verse 23 and 24 of the chapter we're looking at, chapter 23. So I'll read it to you. It says, what sorrow awaits for you teachers of the law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are careful to tithe, that means give a tenth, of even the tiniest income, for instance, from your herb gardens, but you ignore the really important aspects of the law, like justice and mercy and faith. You should tithe, yes, but don't neglect the more important things. You blind guides. You strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but instead you swallow a camel. Another absurd and quite funny analogy Jesus uses to describe the consequences of their actions. Obsessive attention to detail, minuscule detail of their man-made rules, what they can and can't do, and while missing the big picture, missing the obvious big stuff, the really important stuff. So Jesus' instruction to his disciples was not to follow the Pharisees, to pretty much ignore them. More than that, beware of them. In one place he says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, speaking symbolically, of course. That's pretty strong words, isn't it? And of course, it made him their number one target. They needed to get rid of Jesus, their number one critic. So Christ's description of the blind leading the blind is actually just as relevant today as it was then, isn't it? Not only are we to be wary of the characteristics we see in the Pharisees in present day leaders, but it's a warning to examine our own actions, isn't it? If we're in a position of leadership in any sphere of life, it should give us pause for thought. Do we practice what we preach? Show a good example of what we're saying to do in our own lives? Or do we just dish it out and think it doesn't apply to us? According to Jesus, that makes us a blind leader, heading straight for a pit, and we'll take those who follow us straight into it. Strong words, but wise words. Well, thanks for listening. God bless. Bye for now.